Hey, this is Brian Datesman, editor-in-chief of The Intellectualist, and this is the fourth episode of History of the Present done in conjunction with Lincoln Square. In this series, we're looking at major historical turning points that are happening right now, whether it relates to democracy, inequality, media, science, AI, and the changing geopolitical order. And our part of what we do here is we bring on guests who can help make sense of how all these forces are shaping the present. So today, I'm very happy and honored to be joined by Niall Stanage, White House columnist at The Hill. Niall studied English at St. Edmund Hall, Oxford. He's a former editor of McGill magazine in Ireland. I hope I said that correctly. And is the author of Redemption Song, an Irish reporter inside the Obama campaign. He spent years interpreting American politics from inside Washington while still bringing the perspective of an outsider. Niall, thank you for being here. And how are you doing today?
I'm great, Brian, and I'm looking forward to this conversation. I appreciate the invite. Plenty to talk about, for sure.
Of course. And so let's start this. Let's start with a clip, because we're really going to focus today on media, what is happening in Washington, D.C., and particularly what is going on in terms of the Trump administration as we prepare for 2026. So let's start with this clip, and let's talk about it after.
Thanks, Caroline. Earlier, you were just defending ICE agents generally, and earlier on, Secretary Noem spoke to the media, and she said, among other things, that they are doing everything correctly. 32 people died in ICE custody last year. 170 US citizens were detained by ICE, and Renee Good was shot in the head and killed by an ICE agent. How does that equate to them doing everything correctly?
Why was Renee Good unfortunately and tragically killed?
Are you asking me my opinion? Because an ICE agent acted recklessly and killed her unjustifiably.
Oh, okay. So you're a biased reporter with a left-wing opinion.
What do you want me to do?
Yeah, because you're a left-wing hack. You're not a reporter. You're posing in this room as a journalist, and it's so clear by the premise of your question. And you and the people in the media who have such biases but fake like you're a journalist, you shouldn't even be sitting in that seat.
Niall, that was quite a scene that we just saw. Can you just talk about that really quickly? I mean, in your experience talking to power, how common is it for a press spokesperson, particularly at that level of a presidential spokesperson, directly insulting you?
Well, I suppose that part is pretty uncommon. In terms of talking through it, that clip has been seen by a lot of people. It's several months in the past now, and people can make up their own mind. Anytime you're in a journalistic situation, the only thing that you can hope for is that you conduct yourself in a way that you're happy with, content with, and I certainly am content with the way I conducted myself there. Now, I think one thing I would say about the ramifications or the aftershocks from that is I know the time that we're in is one where it goes viral and the headline is inevitably either reporter makes White House press secretary say something, or White House press secretary blasts reporter as whatever. And what I wouldn't like to get lost, I guess, in the middle of all that was the import of what was actually being discussed there, which was Renee Good, a citizen of this country, being shot dead by an agent of the government, and she was then objectively speaking besmirched by some of the most powerful people in the country who misrepresented the circumstances of her killing. So that was, I think, the importance of it for me, and that was, frankly, the importance of that exchange to me.
Niall, I think some of the reasons why there was such a reaction and that clip went so viral is because Americans are not used to U.S. journalists speaking to people in power like that. And I'm curious if that is a fair inference to make. And obviously, I don't want you to criticize your colleagues, but it seems like there's a different approach, maybe, and maybe you can speak to that, particularly in your background.
Yeah, that's absolutely true, Brian. I couldn't have put it much better myself. In either Irish or British journalism, there is typically a more adversarial approach taken to those in power. Now, I don't want to deride my colleagues. I think there are some people in the White House briefing room who ask excellent questions, who ask pointed questions. But there is also a tendency, in my view, to tread too softly, to be a little too deferential, to want to not get into rambunctious exchanges, as is probably evident. I don't mind a rambunctious exchange, but more to the point, I mean, I could cite particular British or Irish interviewers. Emily Maitlis, who American viewers might know from an interview she did with Prince Andrew, as he then was, over Epstein, it can be quite adversarial. Jeremy Paxman, who was a presenter on Newsnight, the same BBC programme, extremely so. Once asked a British Home Secretary the same question, I think 12 or 13 times in succession, because he wasn't happy with the answer he was getting. That approach is rarer in American journalism. And in fact, not to be overly narcissistic and bring it back to myself, but during the Biden administration, I had fairly tense exchanges in that briefing room, particularly over Gaza. And after one of them, an English-born journalist was noting to me that were those questions asked in Westminster or elsewhere, they would be unremarkable, whereas there's a slight intake of breath when you ask questions in that fashion sometimes in the briefing room.
Now, can you speak to that a little? Because we had a revolution, right? And we talk a lot about, and I'm sure you've seen, we talk a lot about liberty, freedom, sticking it to the man, right? Why is there this deference, particularly when there's so much documented news going on that would suggest maybe it'd be better for doing a tougher approach?
I don't have a brilliant answer to that question. I think there should be a tougher approach because, without sounding sort of sanctimonious or vainglorious about it, the press is there to ask questions that the public have a right to have answered. And I think sometimes, and again, this isn't everyone in the briefing room, but sometimes there is a propensity to ask questions in order to impress other people in the room or in order to demonstrate the granularity of your knowledge, rather than asking questions that people would want answered. And I take the view that there are about 50 seats in that briefing room and about 350 million people in this country. So the vast majority of people won't get the chance to ask any questions. So if I am afforded that privilege, I should try to ask something that they want the answer to.
Niall, thank you. And, I'm curious, you've seen this, you talked about President Biden. I know you wrote about President Obama, and you've had an adversarial relationship at times. We were just discussing with President Biden. I'm curious, there's been the Trump administration, when they started, I recall, they were there January 20th, 2025. There are all these oligarchs there, media, billionaires, and he's presented himself to the American people as he inaugurates. And there is this sort of triumphalist, because this was in the aftermath of January 6th. President Donald Trump was convicted of 34 crimes. He was indicted for a number of very serious felonies, including under the Espionage Act. And I'm getting to this triumphalism because I'm trying to, we're talking about, let's get into the Epstein files. I feel that the Epstein files are basically, for Trump, it's a controversy and scandal that he will be unable to escape from. And I'm curious, from just your reporting and your insights, how has the Epstein scandal thrown off the Trump administration?
I think one way that it has been very problematic is that it has been very badly handled. And of course, any scandal or controversy can be badly handled. That happens in administrations. But when you do it with a controversy that has such emotional, visceral power, then you're in some difficulty. So what I mean by that is, for example, if you think about Pam Bondi in the now infamous Fox News interview, where she said that there was a client list on her desk waiting for review or words to that effect. That obviously elevated expectations. And remember, Brian, at the time, it was mostly among the MAGA faithful that there was a belief that the full release of the Epstein files would damage Democrats and perhaps would have no detrimental impact on President Trump or on Republicans. That first statement of Bondi led to a sort of cascade of effects. You had, for example, then the push in Congress to release all of the files, President Trump opposing that right up until the time it became obvious he was going to lose in Congress, and he did a U-turn. So that basic political competency question, I think, was an issue there, but also the very nature of Epstein, this rich predator who was perceived certainly to be playing off of his connections, off of his wealth, off of his influence. I mean, it's just a very, very combustible mix.
Why do you think the president is against releasing the Epstein files? Really serious question. He's the president of the United States. He's a 79-year-old man. He's a grandfather. The crimes described and the crimes that are described, any most reasonable people would want to get this information out for justice, to hope, for some justice for the survivors. Do you have any insight why he's so against this?
I think that, a couple of things. One is, in fairness, there has not been a smoking gun that is absolutely damning enough Trump himself in the material that is released. There's been a whole other issue about what was released and what wasn't. Roger Sullenberger had done a lot of good work on that, and so have other journalists, Barry Levine and others. But I think that, so I don't really take the view that Trump wishes to conceal things because there is something massively incriminating of him, actually. I think his fear is that it becomes an endless cycle where people are never satisfied. And so now we have the Department of Justice, for example, arguing that they have released everything that is responsive to that congressional law. A lot of people are dissatisfied with that. And I think, there is the possibility or the plausible prospect that the Epstein matter becomes sort of this generation's JFK assassination, where people never believe the truth is being told, regardless of how much information is put into the public domain.
Niall, how is the president? How has the president performed though? In let's say let's say that there's a lot of smoke, but there's no fire, right? Mm-hmm. How has the president performed in making that the case? Hey, I was, it's well known he was friends with Jeffrey Epstein. He had a long relationship. He did praise Ghislaine Maxwell, his co-conspirator, I believe, during the COVID pandemic, saying basically, I wish her well. How do you grade the political acumen of this White House dealing with this particular scandal?
And not great. I think there has been an attempt often to bluster through. This actually gets back to where we started in a sense, Brian, because we were talking about the propensity right now for adversarial moments between the president or his aides and journalists to go viral because there's some sort of confrontation. There was one of those comparatively recently, you might remember, where President Trump complained that Caitlin Collins of CNN didn't smile enough. What she was asking about was the Jeffrey Epstein matter, obviously an inappropriate subject for anybody to be smiling about. And I cite that as an example of the way there is an attempt to bluster through, or sometimes to attack journalists, attack the messenger, when in fact it is the underlying subject matter that needs answers. And clearly, if you look at opinion polling, there was a feeling that those questions were not being answered satisfactorily by this administration.
Why do you think in other advanced economies, democracies like the United Kingdom, for instance, there has been Prince Andrew, for instance, he was punished, albeit right? He wasn't imprisoned, but there has been some punishment, and there possibly could be more. Why don't you think that's happening in the United States?
It's a great question. I mean, there clearly has been more in Britain in particular, not only regarding Andrew Mountbatten Windsor, but the whole Peter Mandelson affair. I don't want to go into every crevice of that, but formerly the British ambassador to the US, who was fired over his links with Epstein. He denies wrongdoing, but it's a whole saga in British politics. One thing that I do wonder about, Brian, is whether there have been so many shocking controversies in this country over the past several years. Have people become desensitized to some of this stuff to some degree? There's also just the fact that there seems to be a political loyalties are so deeply embedded now that it seems to me that supporters of President Trump will accept even other people around him kind of flying by with impunity for actions that might otherwise cause considerable questions. I mean, Howard Lutnick, the Commerce Secretary, for example, was pretty obviously misleading at one point as to his dealings with Epstein and suffered no real consequence for that at all. Why is that? Again, I come back to the combined forces of sort of desensitization, because there's a new furor every week, and the very, very emphatic, deeply embedded loyalty of the hardcore Trump base to him and to the people around him.
Niall, so the president's behavior has been very erratic. All right. He recently released an AI-made image of what appeared to be him presenting himself. He says he was presenting himself as a medical doctor, but he appeared to be presenting himself as a messianic figure in the liking of the Christian Jesus. Right.
Mm-hmm.
What is do you have, I don't want to say insider knowledge, because that's, I mean, what is your understanding of the president's health?
Oh, this is one of those ones that I hate because it sounds like I'm fudging, but I mean, I have no intimate knowledge that isn't in the public domain about the president's health. I think sometimes when you see him, he can appear more vigorous than others. He's certainly given to very unpredictable twists and turns. The thing that you're talking about, where he posted the AI image that I think to almost everybody was clearly intended to be him as Jesus, and then said, "Oh, I thought it was me as a doctor." That was just a sort of head scratching and somewhat absurd. I do think it's notable in that case that he took the original post down. That's not something that we're accustomed to seeing with him, generally speaking.
And Niall, you know, you're you're from Belfast. You're from a community that has a long history of intra-community violence among different peoples. How do you see what's going on with MAGA here? Because I've seen experts talk about Northern Ireland, talk about sort of they've talked about time of troubles and sort of looking at the domestic situation here, particularly since Trump was first inaugurated in 2017. Do you think that's a fair analogy?
I think it is a fair analogy, although the United States, thankfully, is not quite so far along that road yet. The troubles in the north of Ireland were the defining issue of my childhood and adolescence. They'd begun in the late 60s. They mostly came to an end with the Good Friday Agreement in 1998. In the interim, about 3,500 people were killed, primarily in the north of Ireland, which has a population about the size of Nebraska's. It's a landmass about the size, broadly speaking, of Connecticut. So a very traumatic context that I'm familiar with, and many people I know suffered much more acutely than I did as a consequence of that. I say all of that by way of explaining that one of the reasons for that conflict was a political tribalism or political sectarianism. It doesn't map exactly onto the United States, because obviously part of it was between people who believed themselves British and people who believed themselves Irish. But the tendency to think of the other side as subversive or as evil or as raising concerns that were fake or duplicitous or mendacious, all of that is part of the picture, as is the propensity of some politicians to use extremely inflammatory language. Shortly after January the 6th, I wrote for The Hill about this. A now deceased Protestant fundamentalist preacher of my youth called Reverend Ian Paisley, who spoke in kind of blood-curdling terms often about the Catholic nationalist minority. And in my view, and the view of many others, that inflammatory language inspired others to inflammatory actions, and people died as a result.
And right now, so it's April 2026. The midterms are coming ahead, obviously, in November. How do you see Republicans in the House? If you can speak to this, how do Republicans in the House? They see the polling. The polling is not good for the president. It's historically bad. How is that impacting their calculations?
Well, I think one calculation is that although most, when speaking publicly, will support the president in the war on Iran, the number who actually want to run on the war in Iran is minuscule. I mean, this is not a subject that helps Republicans at all. It's been a conflict that has been unpopular even since its inception. We can talk, if you like, about the difficulties the administration has had in finding a compelling rationale for why it needed to happen and needed to happen now. And I think more to the point, it has plainly had negative economic impact on the United States and the global economy. But for the purposes of midterms, it's the United States that matters. Gas prices rising, the prospect of other prices rising across the board. That is a terrible framework within which to run as a Republican. So there is consternation, I would say, about that.
Now we'll get back to causes for the war in terms of what the Trump administration has asserted. You kind of touched on this a little implicitly, that there's a dichotomy between what is said in public and what is said in private. What is said in private? What are things that Americans should know that lawmakers, particularly members of the president's own party, what do they think of the president? Do they love him? Like when he speaks, he says they love me. I'm the best president. I am better than President George Washington and Abraham Lincoln combined. All right. My question to you, Niall, is that accurate? No. Is that accurate based on what are the people? What are the lawmakers in private? Do they think that of the president?
So there are some who do, right? There is now a cohort of very, very emphatically pro-Trump lawmakers, and some of those anti-Trump Republicans, as we know, have been removed, have been exiled from the party, really. But there is definitely broader concerns about the way he conducts himself and conducts business. I mean, just look at the number of times you and your viewers will have seen Republican lawmakers purport to claim that they haven't had a chance to read the latest Truth Social post or the latest message that he has given out in some shape or form. What that speaks to is just concern about his manner of conducting political business. But there is still, I think, a very clear awareness of how much, not more than influence, what a firm grip he exerts on the Republican Party and on the Republican Party base. Yes, there's some sign of some splintering. We've seen prominent commentators certainly criticize the war. But in terms of who controls the Republican Party, it's still very clearly Donald Trump.
And Niall, I mean, and just to kind of maybe press this a little harder, do the president, when some Republicans, in your experience, do some Republicans who in public praise the president, do they do the same in private with the same degree of how do I say? Do they praise the president in private the same way that they may speak about him in public?
No, I think there's a very keen awareness of the political parameters here. It's not beneficial to any Republican elected official to be publicly critical of President Trump for the most part. So they're not going to want those words, those terms to get out there. I would also just make a bit of a distinction, or it is not only a sort of public-private thing. It is also the fact that there are many, many Republicans who were scathing of then candidate Donald Trump in 2015 and through most of 2016, who have then abandoned those apparently sincerely held objections for proximity to power or for the purpose of ingratiating themselves to power. I mean, most of your viewers can think of names off the top of their head for whom that is true. So it's not only, it's not purely that there are people saying publicly he's great and then muttering behind the scenes that he's terrible. It's also people persuading themselves that he's better than they appeared to think he was when he first came on the scene, or that they appeared to think he was in the immediate aftermath of January the 6th.
When was the last time you saw Niall? When was the last time you saw the president in person?
I guess he was he was leaving the White House on Marine One 4 days ago, so I saw him then.
Would you, it's hard. Obviously, I know you're not a doctor, but and I'm kind of circling back to this, but there is a lot of concern about the president's health. Has he said anything? I'll give you some specifics. He was a reporter asked him, was asking him a question, and he discussed heaven. He said, "I don't know if I'm going to get into heaven. I might not." And he has said this a number of times now. And now there's this fighting with the Pope, where sort of there seems to be an attempt to wrest moral control or the megaphone of that there. And I'm curious because he has been given to alarming statements. But when he's talking openly about, am I going to get into heaven? Niall, I know you're not a therapist or a doctor, but can you maybe speak to that a little? Because there were a lot of people who were saying, why is the president of the United States even talking about this on Air Force One?
Yeah, I'm going to push back here a little bit in that element of his public performance, for want of a better term, I don't necessarily think bespeaks health worries or him believing that, he's at death's door or anything like that. He is famously without filter, and oftentimes that can manifest itself in saying pretty profane things, as he did in the case of Iran, or things that no other politician would say. No question about that at all. This idea, though, that he's that when he talks about heaven, he's doing so because he knows his health is in some sort of serious decline. I don't really go for that. I mean, he is, a man who will shortly be 80. He doesn't like being necessarily reminded of that, but I suspect he's not unusual in 79-year-olds in that respect. So I don't really go for the idea that those comments are signifiers that something doom-laden is about to happen to him.
That's fair, Niall. So you've been studying, working in this country for years. What is your opinion as a journalist, a professional journalist, about the state of democracy in the United States compared to when you first came here?
I have a number of times, particularly on the Hill's debate show, Rising, expressed real concern about where we're heading in terms of democracy. There has, I think, objectively been an erosion of democracy. I was outside the Capitol during the latter part of January the 6th. I never thought I would see such a thing in the United States. I've lived here since 2003. I remember going down to the Capitol that day, and the Trump supporters were sort of up on the scaffolding that had already been erected. And it was this sort of medieval scene, you know, flags flying and people milling around in that awfulness. That was the darkest day in my lifetime for American democracy. The person who had incited those events was re-elected 4 years hence and pardoned the people who had participated in those events. And further, in addition to that, we see attacks on the media, attacks on prominent law firms, attacks on universities, a discomfort with dissent. And obviously that is problematic from any sense of democracy or pluralism in the United States. It's a very, very worrying time. And this, of course, gets to media coverage. I think it is important for the media to state things as they plainly are in many of these issues.
And you know, and the erosion of democracy in the United States. You know, you're a journalist, and you've been sort of on the scene here for a while, and I'm sure you've noticed that there have been a proliferation of sites for news that may be better described as infotainment, propaganda. How is that particularly, and this really gets to where we're going with this, how is the siloization of information, with the idea that we're getting all of our information in from an algorithm that feeds our confirmation bias? So if you hit something, you're just going to get more and more like that, and it creates a worldview. Niall, why is that really so concerning?
I think it's catastrophic in a number of ways. One is that it locks people into their own information bubble. I think often nothing permeates that bubble, irrespective of how fact-based it may be. But of course, it also removes the idea of commonality generally, not only from our politics, but from American society. I mean, you look at even the splintering of television. Broadcast networks now get a fraction of the audience that they got in the 1970s, 80s, or 90s, when the overall population was much smaller. Johnny Carson used to get 17 million viewers a night at what, 11:30 p.m.? And now there's no show on broadcast TV that gets close to that. Now, I'm not saying we need to all go back to the era of Johnny Carson, but that is an example of cultural commonality that has completely broken down, I think, in this country. When it comes to news, you get into a situation where often the purpose of those sort of infotainment sites that you're talking about is simply to sort of shovel more coal onto the furnaces of outrage rather than actually to inform people of anything. And that begets more and more extreme media or faux media coverage and more extreme reactions. So you end up in a situation where in some ways it's depressingly not that surprising that people of a certain political tribe regard members of the other tribe as subversive or evil or un-American or whatever it should happen to be.
Niall, you know, and you're from Northern Ireland. I'm sure you heard of Rupert Murdoch, right? And I'm sure you've heard of his. I'm sure you know his effect on the British media, the Australian media. And if you were to do a graph of American democracy from when Fox News started in '96 to now, you will see the quality of U.S. democracy has declined. Do you think that that's coincidence?
I don't think it's coincidence, but I don't think that Fox News is the sole cause of it. I think that you could trace that graph over a long period of time. And yes, Fox News and the growth of cable news may be part of it. But, there are other elements to that too. The fairness doctrine, for example, the growth of talk radio in many ways, and I've made this point before as well, when people talk about President Trump's approach to politics and political communication, to my mind, he's much more obviously in the lineage of a Rush Limbaugh than he is the lineage of even populist right-wing politicians like, say, Pat Buchanan, maybe. It is much more the mode of communication that I would associate with conservative or right-wing talk radio than it is anything in the political sphere up to this point.
So, Niall, I understand you were traveling recently. I'm always curious to learn, how do people not in the US, right? How do they perceive what's happening? Because I don't know if Americans appreciate that our friends and neighbors, our cousins, right? People, maybe we're talking about Ireland, we're talking about, countries where we have very deep ties. How are people in those nations taking all of the news that we're seeing too?
Often with some degree of horror, I think. And that horror isn't only a sort of European left-leaning sensibility. It's also because many of these nations did have very close relations with the United States, and the United States was sort of culturally revered, certainly in Ireland, for many, many years. Setting aside the Irish example, there was polling done earlier this year, I believe by The Economist, people can double check that, where they tested Trump's approval rating in 6 or 7 European countries, and nowhere was he above 20%. 20. Yeah. So that is pretty telling in terms of how his administration and how his view of the world is seen elsewhere.
In the second administration, the president has been very clear that he would prefer Ukraine to give up territory to Vladimir Putin. He has been very clear in his public affirmations of support of President Vladimir Putin. There has been talk, I believe it was the president of Portugal, and forgive me, I'm paraphrasing. He said the president of the United States, he said objectively a Soviet or Russian asset. And I know that's a very viral claim to make. How in Europe, particularly our NATO allies, how are they seeing this as we've cut funding from Ukraine? And we are openly doing things that are helpful to the Russian Federation, despite the fact that Russia is helping Iran target Americans in Trump's war in Iran. Can you just speak to that? Because this is something that a lot of Americans, they are saying, we see these news about Russia, but everyone says it's fake. It's not true. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, I think this whole picture is viewed with a combination of suspicion and perplexity by many people in Europe. Now, let me put the caveat in. I don't believe and have zero evidence that President Trump is like a Russian asset or something like that. But where I think a lot of people in Western Europe land on this is that they are ceasing to think that the United States is any longer a reliable ally. I think even at the start of the second Trump term, there was a sense of, particularly in relation to Ukraine, oh, well, he's not quite understanding this exactly right or exactly the way we would, so maybe he can be persuaded. That sense, I think, has faded significantly. And so you are watching European leaders, and indeed Mark Carney in Canada, grappling with this perception of what does a world look like when we have to consciously separate ourselves from the United States. That seems to me of a different order of magnitude than it did even during the Bush years, which is when I first came to the United States, where certainly in continental Europe, there was a lot of wariness about the war in Iraq. In Britain, Tony Blair joined that war in Iraq to his own political detriment, etc., etc. But that was a policy difference rather than a sense of fundamental schism. Now, when you have the president, as he did earlier this year, talk with apparent seriousness about seizing Greenland from another NATO member, Denmark, that fundamentally wrenches the whole perception, I think, of the United States in a really significant way.
We've talked about so many areas, and we're sort of threading the needle towards, we're living in an era of very high wealth and very high inequality. And this inequality has a lot of downstream effects in ways that maybe people don't realize. And Niall, I'm going to bring this to journalism. Okay, how has the consolidation, how has the media fared in this? How has the media been impacted in this era of extreme inequality, and how I'm going to stop after this, the downstream effects of that to democracy?
Well, let me start at a granular level there, Brian, because a few years back I was speaking at a prominent American college, I won't name which one, and it was a journalism panel, and we were discussing the lack of diversity in journalism. We were discussing the lack of diversity in journalism at a college where, if I recall correctly, the tuition fees were $50,000 or $55,000 a year. Beyond the undoubtedly important questions of racial diversity and other kinds of diversity, those kinds of college fees in themselves create a journalism that often is staffed from people from more affluent backgrounds. I wasn't raised in poverty, I'm not claiming that, but I came from modest enough background. I could never have become a journalist if the academic qualifications to become one were costing me 50 grand a year. It'd just be out of the question. So that's one element of it. Now, there's a separate question, which I think you were getting at, about this sort of increasing corporatization of media. I will say this, I don't think it is a coincidence that the New York Times, which most people, including me, consider the best newspaper in the country, is controlled by a family whose business is newspapers. That seems not coincidental to me. There has obviously been a shift toward people who have all kinds of other interests, where a journalism enterprise is a sort of wing of a much larger corporate business. We see this particularly in local journalism, local newspapers, which have frankly been catastrophically affected by hedge fund purchases and things like that. So it would take us a long time, obviously, to discuss all of this in full, but that's some of the effects.
And, let's, Niall, why did you come to the United States?
I was kind of fascinated by the United States. I was fascinated by the politics of it, but I had also been fascinated culturally by the United States. I mean, let me just adjust my camera angle for 1 second, because sometimes people are curious who that is behind me. It's a young Bruce Springsteen and Clarence Clemens. And when I was growing up in Ireland, I mean, the music of people like Springsteen or Bob Dylan or Aretha Franklin, I'm making myself sound slightly older than I actually am, but those people were of enormous influence. And so the idea of America always had an enormous lure and attraction to me. The English poet Shelley had some line to the effect that poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world, and the kind of vision of the United States that artists, musical artists and other kind of artists spoke to resonated with me, and I think lots of other people in Ireland and in Europe generally.
Are we losing that now? Are we losing that?
I think it has been eroded I mean, to go from the very big picture to a very specific data point, obviously tourism figures for the United States have fallen quite precipitously. I personally know a number of people who would frequently vacation in the United States who choose not to do so for the moment. And I think that that sense of, when I first came to the United States, there was still a sense of it as an epic country, a country that offered promise, that yes, had difficulties, yes, had inequalities, but was a place of bigness and opportunity. I think that has become much smaller and much more ominous and darker. And I personally regret that it has done. I mean, as someone who has made most of my working life here, it's an act of faith to come to it. You come to the country because you believe in that country. You don't come for purely selfish reasons. I didn't decide to move to some country that I hated. So that the loss of that, I think, is a serious loss.
And Niall, what are you working on now? What can people look for from you? Are you writing any? Are you working on a book? What are you doing now? What can people do if they want to learn more about what you're writing, what you're publishing?
Well, I'm writing my reported column for The Hill. That's called The Memo. You can obviously follow me on Twitter. I still fairly frequently co-host The Hill's debate show Rising. There we have a screen grab of a fairly recent column. So, they go to The Hill or go to my Twitter or go to YouTube and you'll be able to track whatever I'm doing. In terms of longer term projects, I have a couple of things on my mind, but we'll see whether they come to fruition or not.
And Niall, it's been such an honor to have you here to discuss these pertinent issues. I do try to end on a positive note, all right? Because some of this is very heavy. What would you say to people who are worried about the future, worried about democracy, and you've been doing this for a while now, and you've seen the cycles? What would you say to them in ending?
I would say that we were just talking about the power of culture, and I recently reread For Whom the Bell Tolls, Ernest Hemingway's novel about the Spanish Civil War. And among other lines in that book that stands out to me is one of my favorite quotes anywhere, which is that the world is a fine place and worth the fighting for. I think that is important to remember, whatever one's views. Sometimes one can get into the habit of being sort of downcast, or social media sometimes serves to stoke a kind of miserableism or anger.
Right.
But in fact, whatever your values are, the battle of ideas to advance those values is in fact worth fighting. And there have been, whether it's in Ireland or America or anywhere else, politics has sometimes created the pathway to massive advances and massive positive changes too. And I think that is worth remembering at any time.
Niall, it's really been a pleasure to have you here to discuss these issues, and we'd love to have you back on. Please, everyone, please follow The Intellectualist. Please follow Lincoln Square to receive notifications. And we look forward to our next episode. Thank you so much, Niall.
Thanks, Brian. Take care.